It is clear that what we eat, our diets, has important sustainability impacts. For a long time, we have known that poor diets cause multiple diseases. For instance, they are a key risk factor for heart and cardiovascular diseases. Then, something that has become more and more apparent in recent decades is that the food that we consume and that eventually we also need to produce somewhere have major environmental impacts. For instance, in most countries, scientists estimate that the food system is responsible for a quarter to a third of all greenhouse gas emissions. But agriculture has also major effects on biodiversity through its use of land, on pollution of rivers and seas, and on the use of other natural resources, such as fresh water, upon which whole ecosystems depend. Thirdly, the agriculture and food sectors are an important part of our economy. They generate livelihoods, value, they create jobs, and also play a key role in the development of rural areas. Finally, food consumption is highly social, as we know that people derive all sorts of satisfaction and meaning from it. Of course, those diet issues are subject to intense public debate, and in fact, it seems that not a day goes by without hearing about a new miracle diet. However, understanding what individuals and governments can actually do to change diets in order to improve the sustainability of the food system is far from clear. Our research was aimed at filling some of this knowledge gap. At a very broad level, the research question is rather simple. How should we tell people to adjust their eating behaviors in order to improve public health and reduce the climate impact of their diet? This is in fact a question of practical importance to policymakers interested in agriculture and food issues. Imagine that you are a policymaker, maybe in a cross-departmental position such as the Prime Minister's office, and that you have a given budget, say 1 million euros, to run a social marketing campaign to improve the sustainability of diets. What should you do and tell people? There are many possibilities. You can always do nothing and decide that the money would be better spent on other public projects, maybe to support hospital care or improve road safety, subsidize organic farmers, and so on. Or you decide to run a focus campaign, but then there are many potential targets. We know that people drown under information, so that a marketing message to be effective should be simple and clear, which means here that we can only stress a single aspect of the diet. So which one should that be? There are many candidates. Should we urge people to consume more fruits and vegetables, as has been done in many countries? Should the campaign focus on reducing intake of salt, which we know is a big killer, or meat consumption? What about junk foods and sugar? Or would it be better to tell people to consume more fibers? Simple question, but unfortunately the answers are far from obvious because of the many dimensions of sustainability and potentially conflicting effects of dietary changes on health, the environment, and the economy. We are also never sure how real-world consumers and citizens may respond to policies. And in the case of foods, a key difficulty is to anticipate substitution. Simply put, if we eat less of something, say candies, perhaps as a result of a social marketing campaign, we are going to eat more of something else, but that something is typically unknown. We ran 3 parallel studies in Denmark, Finland, and France to compare results across EU countries. In each country, we first gathered detailed microeconomic data on food consumption of individuals and households in order to analyze diets and their socioeconomic determinants. We then collected data on mortality, people dying, and morbidity, people getting ill without dying, from diet-related diseases, as well as parameters defining how the risk of developing a disease increases with the composition of the diet. Finally, we obtained the carbon footprint of each food from life cycle analysis, or LCA, which tracks the pollution generated in the production, transport, and preparation of food from primary production to final consumption. The data can tell us, for instance, that consumption of a kilogram of beef results in over 40 kilograms of CO2 equivalent, a measure of climate impact, versus 0.8 kilogram for a kilogram of potatoes. There were many challenges involved in data gathering. Sometimes the data were just not available. For instance, we would have liked to capture other environmental impacts, but that the required data did not exist. Sometimes the data were costly to purchase or different across countries, making comparison difficult. We built a model to simulate how the average diet of each country would likely respond to different types of campaigns: eat more vegetables, eat less meat, eat less animal products, and so on. And what the effects of those changes would be on three things. One, the number of people dying from preventable diet-related causes. Two, greenhouse gas emissions, a measure of climate impact. And three, the enjoyment that people derive from eating food. After estimating those effects, we're translating them into costs and benefits, which can be difficult because some of the effects do not have prices. For instance, health. As you can imagine, it is not easy to put a price tag on a life saved, but it can be done by using appropriate valuation methods that have been developed by economists. Two main results. One, in all three countries, the do-nothing option is never preferred in the sense that we find targeted campaigns that would generate benefits in excess of their costs. In other words, running those social marketing campaigns would represent good value for money. Two, if we go back to the original question, what should we tell consumers? It actually depends on each country, which is a reflection of differences in tastes and initial diets. In Finland and France, the most effective campaign would tell consumers to eat more fruits and vegetables. In Denmark, on the other hand, the message would be to consume less animal products, whether those might be meat, eggs, or dairy. The main implication of our research is that governments should run many more media campaigns to modify consumers' food choices. In other words, governments currently underinvest in the provision of information to consumers about sustainable diets. This conclusion is actually more surprising than it may sound. It contrasts with a large body of research, in particular in public health, which considers that information does not affect behavior. So why is the difference in conclusions? In the paper that we wrote, we suggest two potential explanations. First, I think that policymakers need to revise their expectations about the impact of social media campaigns. What our study shows is that even though changes in consumption are quite small, for instance, a 5-a-day campaign targeting fruits and vegetables may only result in an increase in consumption by 20 grams per day, or the equivalent of a quarter of an apple, it is likely to be cost beneficial. Second, consumers need regular reminders of how they should change their behavior, and social marketing campaigns need to be sustained. In effect, promoting sustainable habits should be similar to how private businesses build and maintain their brands. Once a company has installed itself on the market, it cannot stop investing in all marketing activities. Consumers need to be reminded again and again. In that sense, public authorities should think more like businesses about their social marketing activities. Behaviors and food issues are often complex and unexpected, sometimes defying intuition. To illustrate, according to our model, telling consumers in France to reduce their consumption of meat would actually raise their carbon footprint. Why? Because while reducing their total consumption of meat, French consumers will also substitute meats for one another within the category, replacing less impacting categories such as poultry with more impacting ones such as beef or lamb. But those complexities are what makes research interesting. With those words, I will conclude by thanking you for your attention And please don't forget, eat more fruits and vegetables. It is good for your health and good for the climate. Because being a researcher is a lifelong learning process with a useful purpose, namely to build knowledge for society and contribute to the resolution of important social issues.